Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday with me, Jayne Secker. Well, it was an evening which began with silent reflection and ended in anger and violence. Hundreds of women gathered on Clapham Common to remember Sarah Everard, to hold her memory dear and demand changes that would make all of us feel safer. Some of those there had tears in their eyes. One woman told me that she came with a broken heart. Well, the Metropolitan Police had refused to give the organisers a permit because of COVID restrictions. As the sun dipped, officers pushed their way onto the bandstand amid boos and the chants of "let her speak." Instead of speaking, there were arrests. And this morning, an outcry from across the political spectrum with calls for the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida, to resign. Well, should she? Today, we will put that to the Minister for Safeguarding, Victoria Atkins, who'll be joining us in just a moment. We'll also be hearing from Labour's Jess Phillips. The Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird, is also on the show to share her expertise. And we'll be talking about where we go from here with Diane Abbott, one of Westminster's most independent-minded MPs. Also, the co-founder of the Women's Equality Party, Catherine Mayer, and the chair of the Mayor of London's Violence Against Women and Girls panel, Joan Smith. Well, last night the gathering was peaceful, although pretty vocal, until the police pushed their way in to try to bring it to an end. And it's their behaviour which is now under scrutiny. In a moment, we'll speak to the Safeguarding Minister, Victoria Atkins, but first let's hear from some of the women who attended last night's vigil.
Why do you think this case in particular has really cut through, that people feel so strongly about it that they're willing to come down despite the fact they know it's illegal?
I think that people can see themselves in this case. I've yet to meet a woman who hasn't had those feelings walking home of being followed, of clutching your keys a little bit tighter because you want to be able to defend yourself should someone jump out, checking over your shoulder when you unlock the front door, and, you know, through to much more serious things. I think it's important that we also remember there's like a human being at the centre of this, and I think, you know, some of that feeling is grief.
This is not the organised vigil. These are people who've just come down here this evening because they are angry and also because they are upset.
My heart is broken. Why? That's why. Because we can't flipping go outside without having keys between your fingers, without telling everyone where you are. You can't do anything without feeling unsafe. And I think we need to come and show our respect to Sarah and her family.
We spend our whole lives, we grow up being taught to live in fear. We don't get taught to not attack women growing up. I can't talk to you eloquently right now, I'm just too emotional. I came because I wanted to pay my respects to a woman who reminds us all of ourselves so prominently.
It's clearly really hard for you, but you still wanted to come.
Yeah, thankfully we're local to the area, so it's safe too in a way, but yeah, it definitely feels important to be here.
We've been thinking about Sarah for the last 10 days and it felt really important to come and quietly show our respects, really, and that's why we came. I've got 2 teenagers and I want them to feel safe on the street, and it felt important actually to be outside today. That's why we came.
You're not leaving the area.
A lot of the people here are really, really angry. They're angry at the police and they're making that really clear. But a lot of people here are also incredibly upset. A lot of the people that we spoke to this evening have tears in their eyes.
Well, the Safeguarding Minister, Victoria Atkins, joins us now. Thanks very much for talking to us this morning, Victoria. Given the 7 days we've had, it's International Women's Week, with public anger, great public anger at the place of women in society. What were the police thinking last night?
Well, first of all, can I just reflect on the fact that this has been an unimaginable week for the family and friends of Sarah Everard. The loss that they are suffering is beyond our comprehension. And I think in response to that, the reaction that we've seen from women across the country in terms of their own experiences of sexual harassment in the street and violence and being frightened to walk in our streets is also very, very shocking and very, very upsetting. And so last night,
behaved the way they did.
Through the day, we saw many people come to that particular part of Clapham Common to pay their respects, to lay a flower around the bandstead. And of course, the majority of them had a peaceful experience. Now, the scenes that we've seen later on in the day, in the evening, are very upsetting. And I take it very seriously. The Home Secretary takes it very seriously, which is why she has asked the Metropolitan Commissioner for a report on what has happened last night.
Take a look at this image if you're able to. It's the image of the young girl who is on the ground with the police officers on top of her. Is that the state of British policing today?
You'll have to forgive me, I don't have a screen here, but I hope I'm thinking of the right photograph, because I've seen the photograph both on social media and of course in newspapers. And that photograph is something that the police will have to explain in their report to the Home Secretary. I think any policing of large events is difficult at the best of times, but we're in the middle of a pandemic with all of the rules that flow from that. And of course, last night, people were very, very upset. There was a great deal of emotion, completely understandably. And the police, being as they are operationally independent, will be having to explain that to the Home Secretary in their report.
I mean, you say it's difficult to police in a pandemic. If we think back to the images that we saw a week ago when there were football celebrations in the streets up in Glasgow after Rangers win, hundreds and hundreds of men walking through the streets, essentially just being allowed to by the police. This was a very small group of women who were confined onto a bandstand. I was there. It was cold. It was dark. People were petering away. What was the rationale behind going in to stop that?
Well, as I say, it is for the police to make these decisions, often in the moment when they're policing major events. But I'm pleased that you were able to go. I myself chose to take part in the virtual vigil. We found, I hope between us, we found many different ways of marking our respect and marking our concerns about the issues that have been raised this week. But as I say, the Home Secretary has required a report from the Met Commissioner to look into these. And that's right, because the police have to be operationally independent. I don't think anyone would want a scenario whereby politicians are directing the police. But it is also right that they are held to account by democratically elected politicians and that they explain their actions to the wider public. And indeed, just today, I've seen that the borough commander has acknowledged on social media that last night was very difficult. They're in a very difficult place at the moment. And so I do hope that we'll be hearing explanations in the hours and days to come.
I mean, another report, Priti Patel says, I mean, I can tell you that the women there last night didn't want another report. They wanted something done. Do you think our police force is sexist? Do you think what you saw last night was sexist policing?
Well, actually, if I may just take you up on that point about action. We, in response to the outpourings of anger and experiences that we've heard this week, on Friday we reopened the public survey that has been feeding into and shaping our forthcoming national strategy on tackling violence against women and girls. This is the largest ever survey that's ever been conducted to tackle violence against women and girls, and already by the time of the deadline we had 15,000 responses from members of the public. I'm really pleased to say that since we reopened it at 6 p.m. on Friday, we've had a further 20,000 responses from the public. So look, if you want change, if you want your voices to be heard, we are listening, and please, please put your views, your experiences into the public survey. If you look at the gov.uk website, it's there. Please tell us your views and experiences, because then you can help us shape this strategy that we're creating and that will be published later this year.
But there will be a lot of women who will listen to what you're saying and saying that these are simply platitudes. You know, we're going to talk to Vera Baird in a short while, the Victims Commissioner. She has put together a number of reports about failings in the criminal justice system, in the police service, towards women. It's another report, isn't it? Priti Patel is the Home Secretary. Has she not got any ideas of her own? Why is she asking the whole population to come up with a strategy for her? This is a problem. Women in society and the levels of crime that they are victims to, that we are well aware of. We need action, not more research.
And in fairness, you have seen action from this government. At the moment, we have the domestic abuse bill going through Parliament. I have led on that. This is a groundbreaking piece of legislation that is really changing the way that victims of domestic abuse are treated, and in addition, perpetrators of domestic abuse are treated. This is real action that will have a huge impact on the 2.3 million victims of domestic abuse that we know live in this country. But that is in violence in the home. The next step now is us looking at violence on the street and other forms of violence against women and girls. There is a huge range of different crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls, from sexual harassment in the streets through to FGM, forced marriage and stalking. The government is absolutely working on all of this, and the national strategy that is being published this year is because we want to set this for local commissioners, the police, councils, etc. across the country. We want this to be the guide, if you like, to tackling these sorts of crimes. I really don't think it's fair to sort of make those allegations that you're making. I totally understand why, in the spirit and the emotion of the moments this week, that the people are thinking that. But believe you me, this comes from the very top. The Prime Minister is personally committed to this, the Home Secretary is, and I am. This is a huge piece of work, and we want to listen to members of the public. My goodness, if we weren't listening to members of the public, I think you would rightly be criticising us, actually. And some of the experiences that we've heard this week absolutely must be reflected in our national strategy going forward.
Well, let's move away from, as you say, the spirit and the emotion of the week. Let's just look at brutal facts. Over the last 11 years of the Conservative government, the rate of rape, so this isn't this is the rape of rape charges. So this isn't people going to court and being found guilty or not guilty. It's the percentage of people who actually get charged by a police officer with rape. It's 1.4%. That's happened under the Conservative government. In the last couple of weeks, Anthony Williams given a 5-year sentence for throttling his wife in lockdown. Apparently, he just flipped. Also, in the last couple of weeks, a man was spared jail after dragging a woman to the ground and molesting her. Part of his defence in court was, if he went to jail, he would lose his job. These are crimes against women, and women look at what happens when they report crimes and they say that this government, this police force, this justice service isn't serving us.
And we absolutely hear that, and what is more, we want it to change, which is why, as part of, on top of the work that we're doing with the domestic abuse bill and the tackling violence against women and girls strategy, we are also conducting an in-depth review into the criminal justice system from end to end when it comes to rape and sexual assault investigations. It is absolutely in-depth. I mean, two of the examples you've given there, the sentence and the, both of the sentences, of course, those are matters for judges. The judiciary are independent of government, but that has not stopped us looking at their role in the course of this end-to-end rape review. It is absolutely critical that every single part of the criminal justice system plays its role in ensuring that perpetrators are brought to justice. And by way of example, only tomorrow we are bringing forward the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, and one of the most important measures in that that, as far as I'm concerned, is that we will be increasing the minimum sentence that serious and violent offenders serve in prison. At the moment, they're let out at halfway through their sentence. We're increasing that to 2/3 because we absolutely understand the public's horror that violent and sexual offenders should be let out of jail at an early stage in their sentence. So that is just one example. We're also making very real changes to what are called sexual harm prevention orders and sexual risk orders. These are orders that can be imposed either when someone has been convicted or when if there hasn't been a conviction at all in the case of sexual risk orders. These orders help the police to manage these sexual offenders, and we're going to make these orders even tougher. So we're going to require, for example, where appropriate, that offenders have to undertake positive requirements as part of the order. So there's a huge amount of work going on this because we absolutely understand and recognise public concern about this, and we want to deal with it.
You're the safeguarding minister, you will know these figures, but if you're a police officer accused of domestic violence, you're less likely to be convicted compared to the general population. Around 3.9% of police officers are convicted compared to around 6.2% of those in the general population. I mean, some would say that both of sets of those figures are pretty low. Do you think the police, as it is at the moment, should be investigating their own? Do you think we need changes there?
Well, we've got a training programme called Domestic Abuse Matters, which is being rolled out across police forces, primarily to help them support victims and investigate some of the most difficult domestic abuse crimes that exist. So we long know that people in the past have tended to think of domestic abuse as perhaps physical violence. Sadly, we know it is not restricted to physical violence, and it can include coercive controlling behaviour and the many, many forms in which that can be deployed. And what we have found is that as this training has been rolled out, not only have the conviction rates in those force areas very much improved, but also that police officers themselves have either realised that they themselves are victims of domestic abuse or they are worried about their own behaviour. And so I've always said, you know, the bill, this is a landmark piece of legislation. I mean, in the bill itself, we've responded to the concerns, for example, about the increase in non-fatal strangulation. We're prohibiting that in this bill. We've responded to the concerns about threats to use revenge porn. We've put that in the bill. And we have responded to the concerns about the so-called rough sex defence. These are all issues that affect women, not just in personal relationships, but in when they're out on dates and so on. And so what we've wanted with this bill is to really, really start a conversation about abusive behaviour and what we can do to support victims, but also to tackle perpetrators. And on the last matter, what we're doing is investing unprecedented amounts of money now in perpetrator programmes because we want to stop that cycle of abuse. And so I think, you know, we really are at a turning point when it comes to the way in which we as a country are dealing with crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls. I think this week is a really significant moment. I think that, you know, the experiences of women that have been expressed have been absolutely shocking. I think a lot of men have not quite realised what their loved ones, their sisters, their girlfriends, their wives have gone through. And I genuinely believe this could be a moment of change.
Well, a lot of people would welcome that, certainly. I mean, let's roll back to last night and the scenes we saw. There's been a lot of criticism of the policing, also criticism of Cressida Dick, the Lib Dems calling for her to go, Keir Starmer saying that the images are deeply disturbing. Just thinking of the Met and putting the Sarah Everard case aside in terms of police, but, you know, we had that case not that long ago with police taking selfies of themselves with dead women's bodies. Do you think Cressida Dick really needs to go now?
Well, in terms of that incident, I mean, I think everyone was horrified by that, including the Met Commissioner, and those officers were dealt with very quickly. I really, really want to support the Home Secretary in her request to have a report from Cressida. the police have got a tough job in policing the coronavirus pandemic more generally at the moment. I think, we
time to be taking selfies of themselves, should they? If, they're dealing with a pandemic, they're dealing with all of this, it just doesn't seem that their priorities are in the right place.
Well, if I may, I wouldn't want the entire police force across the country, the 43 police forces, to be tarred with those incidents. The police officers I've had the pleasure of working with, not just as a minister, but in my previous role prosecuting criminals, that is not behaviour that I've ever clearly witnessed. So I think this morning, given how difficult last night was, after what has been an incredibly upsetting week, I'm very keen that we don't preempt that report, and that we give the Met Commissioner a chance to explain what happened last night.
So you think she should explain? You think there is a potential that she may go?
So the Home Secretary has asked for a report, and I think that's appropriate. The police are operationally independent, but it's right that they explain their actions to the Home Secretary, particularly in the very, very difficult circumstances of this week. So, I think we've got to take this step by step this morning. And again, I'm just very conscious that for the family and friends of Sarah Everard, this is not what anyone wanted, and certainly people who took part in the virtual vigil, people who were there in peace, people who were laying their flowers. This is not what any of us wanted, and I very much hope that we will be talking about the much more positive steps that we can and will be taking to tackle violence against women and girls through the government survey and other work.
Victoria Atkins, we appreciate you coming on this morning. Thank you. Well, lest we forget, International Women's Day was this week. Well, since she was elected in 2015, Labour's Jess Phillips has marked the occasion by reading out the names of the women and girls killed in the UK, where a man has been charged or convicted. This year, there were 118 names.
In this place, we count what we care about. We count the vaccines done, we count the number of people on benefits. We rule or oppose based on a count, and we obsessively track that data. We love to count data about our own popularity. However, we don't currently count dead women. No government study is done into the patterns every year of the data of victims of domestic abuse who are killed, die by suicide or die suddenly. Dead women is a thing we've all just accepted as part of our daily lives. Dead women is just one of those things. Killed women are not vanishingly rare. Killed women are common.
Well, we're going to be talking to Jess Phillips in just a moment. Before we do, let's just remind ourselves of some of the footage that was from last night. This was the peaceful vigil that was held around the bandstand at 6 o'clock last night in Clapham Common. This was not an organised vigil. The Reclaim the Streets had tried to organise a COVID-safe vigil. They weren't able to reach an agreement with the Metropolitan Police, so it was cancelled, and instead it was carried out virtually online at 9:30. But there were many people in Clapham who just felt that they really wanted to come down last night, whether it was allowed or not. And there was an even smaller group of women who were certainly more vocal and more angry. They were on the bandstand and they very much made their feelings known. And then, as we know, we've seen those images as the police came in to try to move them on. Well, let's talk to Labour's Shadow Domestic Violence Minister. Jess Phillips joins us now. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning. You may have heard we talked to Victoria Atkins there. She's saying what we need now is a report from the police, and they want women and men from across the country to also write to the government on their survey to say what they think should be done to improve the lives of women and girls in the UK. Is that enough?
Absolutely not enough. Oh, gosh. Doing another review, whilst I think it's important that the public at this moment of public outpouring feel that they have an avenue for that, and the government survey is one way that people can come forward and say what they think. But the issue of street harassment, the issue of sexual violence, the issue of domestic violence and all violence against women and girls, we know what the problems are. The Home Secretary has known for many years, the Minister has known for many years, and it's it's just, the reality is that last year 24% fewer rape convictions occurred. Domestic homicide is at an all-time high. We don't need a survey, we can take action. We can have policy, both through the domestic abuse bill and also through the bill that is coming before Parliament on Monday. We can change laws that mean that people actually get good sentences for rape, let alone sentenced at all, that street harassment could be a crime because it's not illegal to harass women on the street currently. We don't need a review, we need action.
How much of the problem do you think it is the police? I mean, as someone who was there last night, it did feel that the police slightly misread the mood. You know, they've also advised people in the area, women in the area, not to go out alone. And there was a lot of anger there last night about that. A lot of people there felt that it encouraged a victim-blaming culture. Do you think the police are guilty of this?
Look, the mistake, if we're talking about the vigil specifically, or that the police generally need to be doing more in cases of violence against women and girls, I'm afraid to say that both are true. Yesterday there were, oh gosh, so many missed opportunities throughout the day for the police to work with organisers to create a completely safe vigil so that people could go and have a moment of sorrow and a moment of resistance against what is the experience of pretty much all women in the United Kingdom and around the world. And they missed the opportunity at every turn until what we saw was, you know, a 5'2" tall woman being pinned down with two men on her back. Now, what I have done over many, many years working with the police, there are brilliant police officers in the West Midlands and across the country who spend all their time trying to make it so that women feel confident to come forward. And yesterday, the police undermined that. Women already feel like they won't be believed if they come forward. And the images on the front of every newspaper today, the police should apologise to the coppers in my area who desperately want to help victims of violence against women and girls, because the police reputation in this area needs improvement before we show images of angry men on the backs of women.
Do you think Cressida should go?
Oh gosh, I really don't want to write the headline so that the headline out of this is the Labour Party calls for Cressida to go. Before the vigil had even happened yesterday, I was coming here to talk about what needs to change in this one moment we have, it seems, where the politics and the views and wind is at our back as women who have been fighting for better for generations. And I'm here talking about Cressida Dick. The reality is that I wish that I'd had the heavy hand of the law when I'd been sexually assaulted. I wish for every woman I've ever worked with that the heavy hand of the law had been there for them. I wish for the woman in my constituency this week who was told no further action on the rape that she'd brought forward. I wish the heavy hand of the police had been there for her. But the reality is if Cressida Dick stays or goes, doesn't make women in this country more safe, and that's what I want to talk about. We need to come together to take action. We don't need to just be angry, we need action, and the Minister should be able to lay out to us exactly what they're going to do. The Labour Party has come up with endless suggestions throughout the domestic abuse bill. Something, 37 amendments we put down that would make people safer. And on Monday, we will again be asking the government to look at things like misogyny as a hate crime, street harassment as a crime, and increasing the tariffs on rape. I'm afraid to say the bill that is before us on Monday, in the explanatory notes, which I read on Monday, there is more mentions of statues than there is of women. 10 years for doing something to a statue. What about women?
As you say, let's go back to what we did originally want you to come here and talk about, and it was International Women's Day, the names of the 118 women that you read out in the Commons. What struck me as a news presenter was that there was no more than a handful of those names that I recognised. Dead women don't make the news these days, do they? Why do you think that is? But also, why do you think the Sarah Everard case cut through that and has gained so much attention?
The Sarah Everard case, unfortunately, is not vanishingly rare when we're talking about women killed. women being killed happens every 3 days in this country, and like you say, most people don't know the names of those women, which is why I read them out. The Sarah Everard case, I think, cuts through because it speaks to the every woman experience of feeling unafraid, and because we heard the reports of what she had been doing prior to going missing, the phone call to the boyfriend, the walking on a busy road, it spoke to an experience that every single woman, in fact, the future queen of our country, can even say that it spoke to an experience that she had felt. And that has ignited something in the public that has meant that Sarah Everard, quite rightly, becomes a lightning rod, a pinnacle for us to get behind. And it's not to say that she matters more than those other women who had died. She's one of them, and it's on us to respect her family and to respect all the women who feel frightened, to take this time and make sure that we say enough is enough. What are we going to do tomorrow to make sure that this doesn't happen again?
But being snatched on the street, I mean, it's a dreadful situation what has happened here, but that isn't the real risk for most women, is it? It is very much in the minority that this is how women are attacked. Most of them are attacked at home, at their partner's home or by their partner. The budget did allocate an extra £19 million for domestic abuse in England and Wales. I mean, will that help? Will that make a difference?
Well, the £19 million allocated in the budget was largely to go into perpetrator services, which is absolutely something that we should be looking at. Only £4 million of it was directly for victims, and as Victoria Atkins said this morning, that's 2.3 million victims in the country, so 50p each from this year's budget. You know, obviously, we always need to do more.
Where it should be going, though, you know, we both have two sons, both of us. We don't want our sons to grow up to be the kind of men that behave in this way to women. So it is the men that need to be educated. So shouldn't that be where the funding goes when we look to the future and how we can change society?
I mean, absolutely, we should be investing in perpetrators, and you know, the reality is that the government don't currently have a strategy for perpetrators of domestic abuse, which we've asked for repeatedly. There isn't a government strategy for how to deal with perpetrators. Let's maybe hope that this case has made them change their minds on that. I very much hope so. But you're absolutely right that this is about education, and we made the law a number of years ago that compulsory healthy sex and relationship education had to be going on in schools. That hasn't been started to be rolled out properly because of the pandemic, which is totally understandable. But the government now have a responsibility to be setting standards of what that education has to be and making sure that they are resourcing it properly, because we've seen some terrible examples, for example, of some schools where they're teaching girls that boys are the ones who should instigate sex. So we've got to get this right in education, we've got to get this right in health, we've got to get this right in welfare, we've got to get this right in housing, and we've got to get this right in criminal justice, because in every single metric we are failing, and in every single metric women are getting less safe year on year if you look at the data for convictions and you look at the number of women coming forward.
I mean, it has been a terrible week, a lot of women will say, and we look at the Sarah Everard case and we look at what happened last night. Do you think, as Victoria Atkins said, that maybe this is a turning point? Maybe this is something that a lot of people have known was a problem within society, but it hasn't really found a face, found a voice, and that now we are at that point, real change may occur?
Well, look, I really hope so. As somebody who has been ploughing this furrow for my entire career, not just my entire political career, I really hope that this is the turning point. But I hope that about me too. And not a single piece of legislation has changed in the United Kingdom that would protect people from being sexually harassed at work that didn't already exist. And every recommendation that has been made to the government on women's safety in the workplace since the Me Too movement, which we all thought was a moment, has been rejected by the government out of hand. So when the Minister says this is a turning point, when Priti Patel says this is a turning point, when Boris Johnson says this is a turning point, they have an enormous majority in the House of Commons. They can turn their rhetoric into action, and I want that to be the thing. I don't want platitudes, I don't want nice words, I don't want clapping, I don't even want candles. I want action to change this, because I am tired of reading out so many people's names.
Jess Phillips, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. Well, let's talk more about this with the Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird. She joins us now, and she has, of course, carried out a great amount of research over the years into what is happening in our criminal justice system, what's happening in the police service. Dame Vera, when you saw the footage last night from Clapham Common, what went through your mind?
Well, I'm afraid I thought it made a bad situation worse, and I didn't understand it. And it will be good when there is a report to the Home Secretary. I'm glad she's called for it. I mean, my reading last night showed that something similar, the same sequence, happened in the West Midlands. I don't know if Jess Phillips mentioned this, but there was that same cancellation because the court wouldn't intervene, and the police said it can't happen. But as in London, people went. They were there for an hour. They had a quiet vigil. They went away again, and the police were nowhere to be seen. And, you know, truly, the organisers tried to cancel the Clapham Common one. They failed completely because obviously emotions are pouring over the top now. And when it happens, you know, with what looked like, you were there, I wasn't, but it looked like thousands of people. You know, there is no real prospect of intervening in it successfully. This quasi-military thing of circling around the bandstand where everybody's just paid good money out of their wages to put a bunch of flowers down and express their view, have, you know, sort of large plod feet on it to push people away. It seems to me to be a dreadful piece of misjudgment. Are they really improving the chances of COVID not spreading by putting their knees in the middle of the back of young women and putting their hands in handcuffs? It didn't seem to me to be the right thing to do.
The Reclaim the Streets marches, of course, and this obviously wasn't an official one, date back to the 1970s. When you look back at those dates, I think we've even got some footage of a picture of one of those back then in those days. Do you think anything has really changed? Are women more or less likely to be victims of domestic violence now, more or less likely to be victims of rape and murder?
I think things have got worse. You were right to go back to the 1970s to make the point that this whole series of issues, victim blaming, Reclaim the Night, was about the Yorkshire Ripper, when the police in Yorkshire, who couldn't catch him for many years, told women to stay off the street. Women's response to that was, he's a man, take men off the street if you want to keep people safe. Do not blame us. And here we are again. It seems the local police were telling women not to go around Clapham Common because of the dangers there. When the reverse is the case, it isn't about women's safety, it's about men's violence.
But we had calls this week for sorry to cut across. We had calls this week for a male curfew. That was met by, you know, a certain amount of hilarity from some quarters. But I mean, you know, in all seriousness, is that something that should be considered?
I think that there's been an arrest in connection with this, and curfew is not the point about the kind of events of predatory male behaviour, you know, abusing women on the street, grabbing hold of them, flashing them. A curfew isn't going to stop that. What needs to happen is a huge culture change. And I have to say, you know, if women's voices could change this behaviour, it would have stopped a very long time ago. We need real leadership, and we need men to speak out against men of this nature who, if they don't get discouraged, take another liberty after another liberty. Shout at a woman this time, nobody stops you. So go to her and tell her why are you not taking any notice of me? I've just shouted at you. Stand in her way. The barriers are pushed if it's not stopped. Isn't the real reflection of all the women who've spoken out, and they were, you know, from trade unionists to students to journalists, people in your kind of position, Jane, all saying they've been harassed in this way, that so far as women are concerned, the streets are lawless. Men can do and say what they wish to women on the street with no sense of a deterrent through fear of the criminal justice system, and no sense for these women that they will be protected in the criminal justice system if they make a complaint. And look, I don't want to go into Sarah Everard's case at all, which is tragic, and one's heart goes absolutely out to her family. But, you know, such notice did the police take, according to the press, of an allegation that this man had flashed at two no doubt worried women in a fast food takeaway a few days before. They were so ready to investigate who that was that they were given a CCTV picture with the license plate of the culprit on it.
And we need to be, I should say, we do need to be so careful because there is an active court case, and we wouldn't want to certainly jeopardise that court case, and that may well be part of the evidence in that case. But you talked about the fact that action needs to be taken. Is the Home Secretary up to the job, do you think?
Oh, it's not for me to tell the Prime Minister who to appoint to his cabinet. The real point is that there is no doubt that the government has been quite responsive over the domestic abuse bill, but it simply doesn't go far enough. And the end-to-end rape review, frankly, few people have any real expectations of it. Throughout the time that it's been running, I mean, the CPS just stopped prosecuting rape in significant numbers 5 years ago. And despite women complaining, despite a court case, despite the end-to-end rape review, they have done nothing to reverse that. It still is 1.4%, as you have already said to yourself. So there needs to be some significant government leadership, and there needs to be a significant drive to change the culture, to acknowledge that we are in real danger of losing confidence in the criminal justice system from half of the population of this country.
You say it needs leadership. It does therefore suggest that you don't especially have confidence in the leadership that's currently being offered.
It's about how active that leadership is, isn't it? And how much it sees what is happening and how much it drives that agenda. I suspect that people in leadership have been taken by surprise by the outpouring, indeed the uproar that there's been from every kind of woman in the last few days. The question is now, is this a turning point? Well, they can make it a turning point. That's the question. Is there the political will to tackle the very serious trouble that the criminal justice system is currently in, not prosecuting cases against women so that it really doesn't seem to women to be worth them complaining? Let's just be really clear. Increasing sentences for sexual offences, but very, very few people are prosecuted for sexual offences. So that's not going to make the slightest difference. The new legislation has some possibilities in it, but it also contains a clause which licenses the police to take mobile phones off women with very little control over that and off every kind of complainant. This is a retrograde step. You know, the trouble that there has been about the CPS finding their own demands for digital download have been intrusive and irrational, and a piece of legislation coming forward will legitimise that kind of behaviour. So we are in a very mixed picture where nobody seems to grab this issue and in a thoroughgoing way go step by step through it and say, this is the problem, let's make an answer. And can I say, they do not listen to victims. I struggle all the time. I have no statutory power. It is my voice. It is the alliances that I can make, that I can use to try to bring change. But the gap between the criminal justice system over here and the experience of victims, particularly women over here, is amazingly large. And they need to do far, far more than just nod in the direction of consulting by having the odd meeting with people. They need to be open and ready to realise the experience and to be determined to put it right.
You say that women's voices aren't being listened to. You know, we've had two female prime ministers. Jackie Smith was the first Home Secretary, female Home Secretary back in 2007. But the Queen as head of state. Female leadership, it seems, does not necessarily affect change in this arena. Why do you think that is?
Well, one suspicion is that it's still overwhelmingly a male-dominated culture. I mean, we obviously have enormous gender inequalities still in economies, in jobs, in representation at high levels. Of course, things have gone a little bit better, but overwhelmingly the culture that dominates is male. It is male priorities that go forward, and some women struggling to try to be heard, like Jess, and, you know, arguably like some of the government ministers who are women, don't pick up, you know, a forward moving culture that is keen to help. It is blocked at every level by the fact that men don't have these experiences. So it's not a priority for men. A really telling thing, you know, when I was a member of Parliament a long time ago, we discussed domestic homicide in Parliament, and it had never been top of any male MP's agenda. As soon as it was really explained what was going on, men started to take an interest. But that was a time of progress. You have to be constantly stepping and pushing to redress institutional inequalities. And if you stop doing that, so for instance, just cut down the number of rape cases you prosecute so that you look as if you're getting a better conviction rate for the ones you take, then the whole thing just settles backwards into the same old male-dominated prejudices. Progress stops so easily. We just need to keep going, and the government does have to lead this.
OK, Vera Baird, Victims Commissioner, good to talk to you. Thanks a lot for joining us. Well, let's broaden out a little bit and discuss where we go from here. I'm joined by three women, one of Westminster's most independent-minded MPs, Diane Abbott, also the co-founder of the Women's Equality Party, Catherine Mayer, and as well the co-chair of the Mayor of London's Violence Against Women and Girls panel, Joan Smith. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Ask you all the same question first and then we'll move on. Cressida Dick, is it time for her to go, Diane Abbott?
We would hope that if she goes, that she's actually replaced with somebody better, someone that doesn't deny institutional racism exists in the police force, and someone with a much less heavy-handed approach to public order issues.
Catherine?
I think that her position is untenable, but the danger of just seeing her resign is that this will then become a problem about her leadership as opposed to being something systemic, as opposed to being something that is not just a failure of policing and the police culture, but also of politics. And I'm really quite worried that rather like the way the Me Too movement sort of unleashed all of these testimonies, but then kind of drew back from the kind of systemic change we needed, that we're at exactly a kind of moment where the same thing could happen. We can make progress now. People see what the problem is, but they will be very easily distracted. And in a horrible way, this churn with Cressida Dick at the top of the police, this discussion, the discussion of what happened last night, it's all very important, but it mustn't distract from the bigger issue.
OK. And Joan, very, very briefly, do you think we should be asking if she should go? Do you think she should go?
My personal view is that she's mishandled this right from the start, right going back to Wednesday, when I was really taken aback by the statement she put out when the Metropolitan Police announced they'd found human remains. And I think she's got the tone wrong from the start. And I agree that, you know, her going is actually not the most important thing at the moment. But I do think there's a serious question about leadership at the Metropolitan Police.
OK. Diane, let's go back to you. A lot of women have been sharing their experiences this week of harassment on the street, of sexism in the workplace. You shared your experiences. You've talked about hearing a man's footsteps and crossing the road as a habit of a lifetime. Have things got better, do you think, from those days when you first got elected into Parliament back in 1987?
Just on the Cressida Dick question, I think it's important to remember that the local police in Lambeth wanted the peaceful vigil to go ahead, were willing to work with the organiser. It was Cressida Dick and people at Scotland Yard that insisted on banning it altogether. Well, everybody knew people would turn up anyway, so she does have questions to answer. In relation to experience of harassment on the street, I think in some ways it's got worse, because what you've got is the online world, which feeds hostility and violence against women. And I was struck when I started to think about it, how much I had always taken it for granted that the potential for violence by men on the street was just something that you had to guard against by crossing the road.
Catherine, do you think there is a link through all of this with what you were trying to do with Women's Equality Party, fighting for equality, equal pay, equal representation, this low level of misogyny? Do you think that that is the root of the problem, that then feeds into the broader picture?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've been seeing in the pandemic, the ways in which inequalities of all kinds are laid bare. The people who were already vulnerable have been made more vulnerable. It has been gendered in its impacts. It has hit people of colour harder. It has hit people with disabilities in different and harder ways. And what you see play out now with this and with this whole discussion, in fact, is as what we're all trying to talk about is the endemic nature of this and the fact that it has not been tackled. It is never tackled. It always, you'll see tinkering about the edges, but it isn't treated like terrorism or as a form of terrorism, as something that is absolutely central and that is linked to all these different sort of cultural strains, to an education system, to forms of inequality that feed back into this and amplify it. And so what you need to do is, in a moment like this where you can see those mechanisms, you need to lay them bare and you need to look for leadership. But, in the political sphere, I keep saying that there are these excellent women like Diane who have been working for years trying to push this up the agenda, and yet it doesn't happen. And yet here we are at our age seeing it in many ways, as Diane said, getting worse, not better. So this is a question about priority. This is a question about understanding the ways in which all of those different inequalities make this not just tragic, but tragically inevitable. And, this is preventable, but it is only preventable if it is made a national priority, if men step up to the plate, if male politicians recognize this, and if there is a wider conversation about, and not just a conversation, I mean, we have a whole load of very specific policy proposals on this, including indeed making it a national priority on the, it should be identified as a national threat, violence against women.
Okay, let's bring in Joan. I mean, Joan, you've talked about living in a society where some humans are worth less than others. Do you think, as Catherine alluded to, that possibly we have hit a turning point, possibly something very good could come of this very, very difficult week?
Well, I very much like to think so, but at the same time, I feel a kind of disconnect between what people say on occasions like this when they're horrified by what's happened to a particular woman, which is absolutely horrendous. And I think we all feel very distressed about it. But some of these people who are expressing, shock and outrage now are the same people who will carelessly read about a rape trial in the newspaper and say, God, well, why was she on her own at night? Why did she go to that man's hotel room? So I think there's a kind of, there's always these moments where it feels as if things are going to change. But what we've actually got is a broken justice system. And that reflects the misogyny of the culture that we inhabit. So for years now, we've had so many rape reviews. I could probably paper the walls of my house with their findings. It doesn't change anything. The conviction rate keeps going down. And that is because of suspicion and disbelief towards women. That is very easy to say, gosh, what happened to this woman was particularly awful. But actually what's happening to thousands, millions of women is awful, but we don't believe them when they tell their stories. And politicians actually, there may be a bit of, at the moment, politicians saying, yes, this is dreadful. But where are the national campaigns? Where are candidates, MPs, councillors getting up and saying, this is terrible, this is enough, this has got to stop. We have to change the culture right from the start.
I mean, that's a good point, isn't it, Diane Abbott? I mean, we look at the government anyway, we're half of the country, but we're only a fifth of those who are in the cabinet, only 34% of the House of Commons, 24% of the Conservative Party. Westminster's been labelled Pestminster in the past because of issues there with sexual harassment. I mean, are we wrong to look to politicians to change this? Should we be looking somewhere else?
Oh, in the end, when you want to see substantive change in a society, the political process is part of that. And to be fair, some of us as women MPs have spoken out about these things, but in the past, it hasn't necessarily been seen as news by the media. We need a change in culture. We need the media to take these things seriously, not when there is one dramatic case, but the steady reality of violence against women. But yes, at the end of the day, this needs legislation, this needs funding, and this needs political action.
And Catherine, briefly, a lot of men this week have been questioning what they can do to make women feel safer. I was chatting to my husband about it, and he said, well, I always cross the road if I'm on my own in a street and there's a woman, because it's just something I was taught when I was younger. But a lot of men don't do that. Do you think that possibly we will see a change in society from men understanding now what women silently go through in their head?
Well, Diane's point about the media is very important here. It's great that you're doing a whole programme on it, but it needs to be the whole media talking about this all the time and in ways that really make people understand and make men understand that this is their issue. So it isn't just about making women feel safer on the street in those small ways. It's about understanding this as a daily experience for women that disfigures the whole of society, that whole kind of thing about not all men trending again. And, the point is, it may not be all men who commit violence, but it is all women, and it is all men for whom this is an issue too. I mean, one of the most bizarre things is seeing people seeking to minimise the experience of women by saying that more men are murdered than women. Yes, by men, 96% of murderers are men. It is a problem for men, and it needs to be seen as one that is for men to step up to the plate and solve. So the awareness that you're talking about is really important, but it goes way beyond this. This is a time for men to actually understand that it is in everybody's interest for them to tackle the problem of male violence.
And Joan, just last thought from you. You referred to all the different reports that have been carried out into violence and how you could have wallpapered your home with them. Suzanne Moore, funnily enough, this week said that misogyny is the wallpaper that we live with. Do you have any real hope that society will change?
Only if we can keep this going. And if men ask themselves questions like, it's not just what do I do if I'm walking down a dark street and I don't want to frighten a woman. It's also what happens when your friend makes a really nasty rape joke or says something demeaning about women that nobody else overhears. Do you act on that? I think, men have to look at their own private behaviour as well and ask themselves, are they tolerating a degree of misogyny, which I'm afraid I've been writing about for most of my adult life. And, it's disappointing that we are still here. But I do think it's up to men to look at their own attitudes, the attitudes of their friends and family, as well as, talking about what happens in public.
Joan Smith, Catherine Mayer and Diane Abbott, thank you all very much for joining us for this special programme. Well, that is it for this week. Stay with us, though, after this short break. We're going to be discussing a bit more what we've heard in the programme on The Take over the next half hour.
For the early risers.
As we examine the story beyond the headline.
For the knowledge seekers.
Welcome to Divided States.
For the straight talkers, the curious, and the ones who want to be entertained.
Backstage, Sky News' entertainment podcast.
For wherever you are.
Welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast.
For the ones who want to know more.
Welcome to the All Out Politics podcast.
For the listeners.
From Sky News Storycast.
Sky News Podcasts. Listen and subscribe for free.
Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge, The Take. We'll take a look through the highlights from today's programme and analyse them with Sky's political correspondent Kate McCann. Well, following the disappearance and death of Sarah Everard this week, it's been marked by an emotional outpouring and a lot of discussions over women's safety. And after police forcefully broke up a vigil in Sarah's memory last night, there are calls for the Met Commissioner to quit. And it's those issues to which we dedicated today's show. And among my guests this morning were the Minister for Safeguarding, Victoria Atkins, Labour's Jess Phillips and the Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird. Well, first, let's take a quick look back at my interview with the Safeguarding Minister, Victoria Atkins. She refused to be drawn on whether Dame Cressida, the Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, should resign over last night's handling of the vigil for Sarah Everard in Clapham Common in South London last night.
Given how difficult last night was, after what has been an incredibly upsetting week, I'm very keen that we don't preempt that report and that we give the Met Commissioner a chance to explain what happened last night.
So you think she should explain? You think there is a potential that she may go?
So the Home Secretary has asked for a report, and I think that's appropriate. You know, the police are operationally independent, but it's right that they explain their actions to the Home Secretary, particularly in the very, very difficult circumstances of this week. So, I think we've got to take this step by step.
Well, let's cross now to our political correspondent, Kate McCann. There has been really widespread criticism of Cressida this morning from a lot of sectors, but again, a lot of people saying, is her going the answer? Will it actually change anything?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that that was reflected actually quite strongly throughout the programme today, that while there is real fury and frustration at the way that this vigil, remember it was a vigil, it wasn't a protest, it wasn't a march, it was a vigil, the way that that was policed last night, I think there is also a sense that there is a much broader problem here which requires a really big change, not just the loss potentially of Cressida Dick. She's under a huge amount of political pressure, as you said. The Met has already issued a statement today and said that they felt that there was a need to intervene because of the concerns about COVID-19. But I think that's a very difficult line to hold when you see actually how some other big events recently have been policed, including football events. And those are the kind of comparisons really that the Met Police are going to have to try and justify against when it comes to their actions. But I think when you take a step back, and we're going to get to clearly Jess Phillips' interview with you, which I think was really striking later in the programme, this is something that requires systemic change. It's not just about trying to lose one senior person. It's about the government looking at it and making policy and listening to women. Now, clearly, they've already taken a step towards that. They've kept that consultation open, 20,000 responses since Sarah Everard's death. But it's going to take more than that, I think.
I mean, the government, pointing to that consultation and saying, that there is the domestic violence abuse bill, which is going through the House as well. So, they say they are taking action. Is the criticism that they aren't doing enough fair, do you think?
Well, certainly some campaigners, in fact, many campaigners would say that it is fair because it's been well known for years now that, for example, rape convictions, prosecutions for rape are not very good when compared to other crimes. That's not a secret. It's not something new. This is a long-term problem that the government has been made aware of repeatedly. And unfortunately, the changes that have been made so far haven't made a difference. So there are questions about whether the action that's being taken is enough. And of course, there is a bill coming before Parliament early next week where all kinds of issues like these, including protests, will be discussed. And I think the question will be for government, how do they make policy which fits the public mood, but also is long-term? Because short-term policy making often isn't very good. There are some really big fundamental questions about behaviour, and a lot of those things are linked, again, as Jess Phillips pointed out, to education, to talking to children in schools about the appropriate way to behave, and actually about a cultural change too, and a shift that's going to require more than a policy to make something happen. So, I mean, it's a huge issue. The government is facing many of them at the moment, but there is such a groundswell and such a feeling that now really is that moment that I think it's going to be really difficult for them to ignore.
I also, Kate, asked Victoria Atkins about whether the rates of charges and convictions, as well as the strength of sentences, are currently acting as a sufficient deterrent against crimes for women. These are the facts that I put to the Minister. Let's just look at brutal facts. Over the last 11 years of the Conservative government, the rate of rape, so this isn't the rape of rape charges, so this isn't people going to court being found guilty or not guilty, it's the percentage of people who actually get charged by a police officer with rape. It's 1.4%. That's happened under the Conservative government. In the last couple of weeks, Anthony Williams given a 5-year sentence for throttling his wife in lockdown. Apparently he just flipped. Also, in the last couple of weeks, a man was spared jail after dragging a woman to the ground and molesting her. Part of his defence in court was if he went to jail, he would lose his job. These are crimes against women, and women look at what happens when they report crimes and they say that this government, this police force, this justice service isn't serving us.
And we absolutely hear that, and what is more, we want it to change, which is why, as part of, on top of the work that we're doing with the domestic abuse bill and the tackling violence against women and girls strategy, we are also conducting an in-depth review into the criminal justice system from end to end when it comes to rape and sexual assault investigations. It is absolutely in-depth. I mean, two of the examples you've given there, the sentence and the, both of the sentences, of course, course, those are matters for judges. The judiciary are independent of government, but that has not stopped us looking at their role in the course of this end-to-end rate review. It is absolutely critical that every single part of the criminal justice system plays its role in ensuring that perpetrators are brought to justice. And by way of example, only tomorrow we are bringing forward the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, and one of the most important measures in that, as far as I'm concerned, is that we will be increasing the minimum sentence that serious and violent offenders serve in prison.
But if you're a police officer accused of domestic violence, you're less likely to be convicted compared to the general population. Around 3.9% of police officers are convicted compared to around 6.2% of those in the general population. I mean, some would say that both of sets of those figures are pretty low. Do you think the police, as it is at the moment, should be investigating their own? Do you think we need changes there?
Well, we've got a training programme called Domestic Abuse Matters, which is being rolled out across police forces, primarily to help them support victims and investigate some of the most difficult domestic abuse crimes that exist. So we long know that people in the past have tended to think of domestic abuse as perhaps physical violence. Sadly, we know it is not restricted to physical violence, and it can include coercive controlling behaviour and the many, many forms in which that can be deployed. And what we have found is that as this training has been rolled out, not only have the conviction rates in those force areas very much improved, but also that police officers themselves have either realised that they themselves are victims of domestic abuse, or they are worried about their own behaviour.
And Kate, it was interesting last night down at Clapham that there was a lot of women there who were angry about Sarah Everard. They were angry about women's place in society. But there were a lot of women there who were very specifically angry at the police. The government has a job to do in terms of rehabilitation here, doesn't it, to get women to trust the police force?
Well, I don't just think it's about the police, although, of course, there is that element to this. It's a much bigger issue of trust, and it's something that we've heard repeatedly over the last couple of months. It's not just since Sarah Everard's, of course, tragic death. This has been an ongoing issue. Lots of people campaigning, for example, about domestic abuse, domestic violence, have been saying to the government, look, you're not funding local authorities well enough to be able to provide the support that's needed. There are charities who are saying we cannot give the help that's required because there isn't enough money for it. There is a huge issue of trust, but there's also an issue of people saying, you know, there is a problem here that needs solving. It won't just be solved by legislation. Some of it is about more funding, but some of it is about listening to those people, listening to those voices and hearing what they are saying. And that does go into what you're talking about, I think, about those women that you spoke to last night at Clapham. There is that sense, actually, that this issue has been going on for such a long time and it has been unsolved, even though, you know, as Victoria Atkins said there have been some steps forward, particularly when it comes to domestic abuse and domestic violence, legislation around that and around coercive control, that's been really positive. But campaigners have been saying for a long time that more needs to be done, and it can't be solved overnight, but it has to be a long-term commitment. I was interested, actually, that Victoria Atkins said that this is something that the Prime Minister is personally committed to. It will be fascinating and actually really important to see how Johnson responds to what's happened over the weekend, not just those events that happened on Clapham Common, but much broader than that, his approach to policy for women and keeping women safe. That's going to be fundamental, I think, in the next couple of weeks and months.
Well, it's interesting because he doesn't have a huge number of women in his cabinet, does he?
No, and again, that's something that's come up repeatedly, hasn't it? And there have been some questions about why, for example, at those coronavirus press conferences, do we not see more female cabinet ministers? Well, the answer often to that is that they're not there, they're not in those positions of power. And of course, you know, Boris Johnson has repeatedly committed himself to making sure that he can have as many women as possible in cabinet positions. But I think for campaigners and for opposition MPs, until they start to see that change happen, they will be quite sceptical about it. Now, of course, the Conservative Party has had 2 female prime ministers. The Labour Party is lagging behind on that front. There are more women in Parliament now than there have been. There are some changes, but we're still talking, for example, about legislation for women being able to take maternity leave when they are in positions of power in government. That only recently came up, only recently was solved by emergency legislation. The fact that that needed to happen shows you that sometimes there is a blind spot. And the reason for that is because women are still forging that path at the very top of government. And right now, in this day and age, when issues like Clapham Common, like Sarah Everard, like domestic violence and abuse and women's safety are coming up, for lots of people, that just isn't good enough.
Well, Kate, also on the programme this morning was Labour's Shadow Domestic Minister, Jess Phillips, Domestic Violence Minister, sorry. I asked her whether the Met Commissioner should go.
I was coming here to talk about what needs to change in this one moment we have, it seems, where the politics and the views and wind is at our back as women who have been fighting for better for generations. And I'm here talking about Cressida Dick. The reality is that I wish that I'd had the heavy hand of the law when I'd been sexually assaulted. I wish for every woman I've ever worked with that the heavy hand of the law had been there for them. I wish for the woman in my constituency this week who was told no further action on the rape that she'd brought forward. I wish the heavy hand of the police had been there for her. But the reality is if Cressida Dick stays or goes, doesn't make women in this country more safe, and that's what I want to talk about. We need to come together to take action. We don't need to just be angry, we need action, and the Minister should be able to lay out to us exactly what they're going to do.
And Kate, she is angry, and it's a subject that she's spoken passionately about, you know, on Sky and in the House repeatedly over time. And, you know, do you think is she right to sort of suggest that actually the media focusing its attention on Cressida Dick and whether she should stay or go is slightly obfuscating the main problem?
Well, look, I think it was reflected repeatedly actually in the programme today that while calling for Cressida Dick to go is what some people have taken away from what happened yesterday, and there certainly is an issue, I think, with the way Clapham Common was policed. That's not going to solve this much broader problem. And there are two things really going on here. There are big questions about the Met and policing in general and consent and the way that policing happens. And, you know, that's become much more of an issue as we've gone on through this pandemic. And there are really big questions when we step back and think about legislation and accountability, because, of course, Parliament hasn't been operating in the way that it ordinarily would because of COVID-19. You know, there haven't been as many MPs allowed in the chamber. There have been some real big questions, actually, about the way that some of the coronavirus legislation has been introduced to the House of Commons, about the way it's been extended. And actually, there have been some questions, too, about policing and about the way that the pandemic has been policed. So that's kind of one part of this issue that I think is fueling a lot of questions about Cressida Dick and the way that she is doing her job. But of course, that's secondary, really, in this conversation to the much broader question about women's safety. And I think for those women, they want to see this conversation continue. They don't want to see this just become an issue for a week where we do, you know, a couple of special programs. They want to see big systemic change. And for that to happen, it requires pressure on government. It requires people saying, look, something needs to happen here. And it can't just be knee-jerk policy making. It has to be long-term change. And that's why there are lots of, you know, not just women and men, campaigners, opposition party leaders, Conservative MPs saying, OK, we need to take a step back now. And we need to think about how we approach this properly. And part of what Jess was saying to you earlier, again, was about education and about health and about how this actually, this issue of women's safety, it's not just a women's issue, it's very much a men's issue. And it's very much about having a conversation about culture and the way that we approach each other and the way that we approach society. And that's difficult and it can't happen instantly. And you can't turn around tomorrow and say, oh, look, we've done this and now it's all fine, it's changed. There have been shifts over time. There have been some positive moves. But of course, people want to see change happen much more quickly. But it will take time. It will take a huge commitment from government to do that. But it will also run alongside this bigger question about trust in policing, trust in government, and trust in the way that those things have maybe shifted because of the pandemic.
Thanks very much for now. Kate, you're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday with me, Jayne Secker. After the break, we'll take a look back at my interview with the Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird, who took a pretty dim view on the police action last night.
This is good technology which has been around for a few years but hasn't been very widely used. And what we'd like to do is to roll it out much faster. We're planning to test 11,000 people over the next year or so across England to see whether they have the early signs of bowel cancer or to give them the all clear. And obviously, the NHS has been under huge pressure during the pandemic. We've got lists of people waiting for colonoscopies. We diagnose more than 100 people a day with bowel cancer, and we have to test many times that with a colonoscopy usually. So this is one way to help take some of the pressure off those waiting lists at the same time as bringing in a technology which is potentially much more convenient for patients, of course. They come through in a few days. You have to analyze the images that come off the recorder that people wear when they take the pill. But then they come through very quickly indeed. We have people trained to read the images that come from the capsule. They produce a report, and those then go back to the patient very quickly. So it's a very straightforward way of looking for things like polyps in the bowel or early cancers. And of course, that's what we want, is to be able to catch cancer at an early stage when it's most curable. It's really just for cancers in the bowel. It will, of course, examine the other parts of the intestine as it passes through. And in fact, I had a patient come to me the other day who'd had one of these capsules who had a tumor in their small intestine, which is much less common. But generally speaking, the main thing we're using it for is to look for bowel cancer.
The truth. This is a forgotten front line. They are dying here. Here it comes.
Boy, have we got some interesting ways of showing you what's going on.
Their message to us: get ready.
Nothing like apocalypse.
Instructing you to stay at home.
I can't believe we did that.
It's pretty special, isn't it?
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Southeast Asia correspondent in Bangkok. We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Hello, welcome back to Sophy Ridge, The Take, this morning with me, Jayne Secker. Well, also on the show this morning was the Victims Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird. And I was keen to get her view on the events last night in Clapham Common.
The organisers tried to cancel the Clapham Common one. They failed completely because obviously emotions are pouring over the top now. And when it happens, you know, with what looked like, you were there, I wasn't, but it looked like thousands of people. You know, there is no real prospect of intervening in it successfully. This quasi-military thing of circling around the bandstand where everybody's just paid good money out of their wages to put a bunch of flowers down and express their view, have, you know, sort of large plod feet on it to push people away. It seems to me to be a dreadful piece of misjudgment. Are they really improving the chances of COVID not spreading by putting their knees in the middle of the back of young women and putting their hands in handcuffs? It didn't seem to me to be the right thing to do.
And Kate, she didn't think it was the right thing to do. She used the phrase quasi-military there, didn't she? But she also talked about the rallies back in the 1970s, the original Reclaim the Night marches, and how, in her view, things appear to have got worse for women in society.
Yeah, and isn't that a damning verdict, a damning indictment? I think what we're seeing now is women taking clearly to the streets again because they feel that not enough change has happened. And, you know, we've talked about how long it takes for things to feel different. But, you know, there was another guest in your programme today who said if women's views and women's action could change the way this happens, then things would have changed a long time ago. Perhaps that's the wrong way of looking at it, if you like, that this isn't a women's issue. It's not an issue for women to go out and march, although, of course, you know, women will do that. They feel the need to do that, to organise and to make a change. But actually, it's much more about men and including everybody in this conversation. You know, we can't exclude people. You know, I don't know about you, Jane, but over the course of the last couple of days, you know, I've spoken to lots of men who I have huge respect for, who are in my life, who had absolutely no idea that it was fairly standard for women, for me, I'm sure that you do the same thing, you know, to run down an alley if it's late at night, to constantly look behind you, as we've heard loads of women say, to have your keys between your fingers. They really didn't genuinely understand the depth of feeling and the fear and the concern that every single woman goes through pretty much every single day of life. And actually, if what this has done is jolt people into that realization, that understanding that this is a fundamental problem in society that won't be solved quickly but does need addressing, then that will be a positive change. It will be something good to take away from something so incredibly tragic. But it will take continued pressure, and campaigners know it will also take policy change. And that's something that the government is going to have to grasp and grapple with. And that's why I say what Boris Johnson's reaction to this is going to be very important.
Kate McCann, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Sophy Ridge, The Take. That is all from me this week. Sophy is going to be back next Sunday. I hope she's having a lovely Mother's Day. Stay with us, though, now, and we will have more on that criticism of the police's handling of that vigil in South London last night. The Met Commissioner continuing to come under fire to leave.